public debt. The first paper is by Daniela Romaniela and Antonella Stirati on potential output versus target unemployment. What we will do is the presentations, 20 minutes, and then 10 minutes for discussion. Okay, Davide, it's yours.
Thank you, Professor Toporowski. Hello, everyone. Today I'm presenting this paper that we are writing with Antonella Stirati, basically on the new fiscal framework of European countries, in which we try to describe the new rules and provide a very simple simulation of an alternative fiscal policy. Let me start from the context. As you know, the Eurozone has been characterized by a very poor macroeconomic performance in the last 25 years. The rate of growth has been slower than in the US, and moreover, territorial divergences has increased within the area. In the spring of 2024, new economic governance framework entered into force, but it seems to have the same difficulties, the same problem of the old rules, in sense that also the new framework has excessive complexity and therefore a lack of transparency of the norms. And in particular, these rules are still based on the GDP potential output, NAIRU, and all these variables that are very difficult to estimate and can produce actually produce procyclical impact. Therefore, the aim and scope of our research is to provide a detailed discussion of the new fiscal rules, also looking at the existing literature and at the experience of the post-Great Recession austerity. Then we try to explore the implications of these new fiscal rules, both in the estimation of potential output and the NAIRU, and try to obtain some policy conclusions. And at the end, we also analyze the impact on debt to GDP ratio and on the deficit to GDP ratio of a different policy. Let me start from what this new fiscal rule in what they consist, in which they consist. According to them, I say that I don't remember the terms, but they need to have a structural adjustment plan for 4 or 5 years, depending on the duration of government. And if the countries extend the duration of the adjustment to 7 years, that country has to encompass structural reforms. They look at the net expenditure, and therefore each country has to be a binding growth rate of net expenditure, where for net expenditure they means net of interest on public debt, expenditure funded by European project, and other measures as the cyclical changes in unemployment subsidies. If an issue is the excessive deficit procedure that can start if the deviation of the net expenditure by the program has to be is higher than 0.3%. Moreover, the path of net expenditure will have to satisfy also a series of targets, as the total deficit that has to be must be tending to 1.5% of GDP, and it has never be above 3% of GDP. The structural primary budget must improve at least 0.4% per year, and the debt to GDP ratio will have to decline by 1% per year. And in particular, the adjustment must be linear during the adjustment period and cannot be postponed. This approach seems to have more shadow than light. In particular, there are a problem with the fact that some elements, for example, the interest payments that have been expurged from the net expenditure, reappear when the rules go toward the numerical targets that the countries has to reappear in the numerical targets concerning the total deficit and debt. For example, I said the interest payments are not considered in the net expenditure, but they enter in the deficit. And actually, for example, for Italy, the only source of deficits are the interest payments. Moreover, the adjustment path is still organized, as I said, looking at the estimation of potential output and NAIRU that are very difficult to do, and for example, the estimation of potential output and NAIRU has changed a lot in each times. And the debt to GDP ratio projection produced by means of Commission's debt sustainability analysis are often different from what turned out to be the actual debt on GDP ratio. We in this rule find a risk of circularity. We have decided to use these terms instead of the procyclicality, because the issue is that the effects are not limited to the cycle. The effect of austerity policy, for example, are not limited to the cycle, but the impact can produce very persistent effect. And therefore, the long story short can be this one: public spending have persistent or permanent effect on GDP, but persistent changes in GDP can lead to changes in estimated potential output. In turn, changes in the potential output can determine the public spending trajectory. Then that, according to the logic of the fiscal rules, will have to be lower than that of potential output, and so on. Which is the framework on which these rules are based. This slide shows the relationship that they have in mind, between actual GDP and linear trend or potential, or the trend of potential output. The point B is represents the effect of a recession that can be induced by austerity on actual output, But however, after a few periods, the standard macroeconomic approach predicts that the actual GDP will converge to or close to the previous exogenous trend. However, in the literature of hysteresis, also in the new Keynesian framework and in mainstream framework, nowadays is accepted that a sharp reduction in actual GDP can produce also a reduction in the potential output that is represented by the dotted red line, and therefore a recession can have persistent effect because after it, the actual output will start to run close to the new potential trend, not the only one. However, it seems that the hysteresis is not considered in the new rules, and also if very famous works, for example, the graph on the left comes from a paper of Ball, while the right comes from the famous paper of Fatas and Summers. Also in the mainstream literature, the evidence of hysteresis and the change in the estimation of potential output after the Great Recession is a fact. As you can see, for example, in the line, the dotted line represents all the revision at the estimation of potential output that occurred in Italy after the year after years, after 2007 to 2011 and 2017. This slide simply represents what happened at the actual variable. As you can see, the level of the GDP, the Italian GDP, is at the end of 2022 still lower than its level in 2007, and also after the dramatic fiscal austerity policies, the ratio between debt and GDP continue to grow, as you can see in the graph on the right. What about the policy implication of these rules? As said, the fiscal consolidation caused permanent scars to GDP, employment, and productivity, and therefore also, for example, in a famous and recent contribution of Cerras, Fatas, and Saxena, the suggestion is to keep the economy at high levels of activity. Moreover, using potential output as the benchmark for fiscal policy causes fundamental problems. For example, it underestimated the impact of fiscal policy both in size and duration, and it caused the problem of circularity that I cited before. But not only the European, moreover, not only the European fiscal rules will have a painful and prolonged negative effect on GDP, employment, and productivity, but they are also likely to be self-defeating in sense that they cannot achieve the objective to reduce the debt GDP ratio. Okay, thank you. Let me describe our very simple exercise of simulations. First of all, we estimate the Ocon. We obtain by the estimation of Okun's law, the Okun's coefficients that represent the reduction, the variation in the unemployment rate that follow an increase in the rate of growth by 1%. Then we set the target unemployment rate at 4.5%, and we decide to reach this goal by 2029. And considering the actual level of unemployment rate, we obtain an annual reduction in the unemployment rate equal to 0.46 percentage point. Using these values, we can calculate the real GDP growth rate of 2.5%. That is, as I said, is necessary to obtain our goal in terms of reduction of unemployment rate. However, we need to obtain a value of public spending because we want to calculate both the debt to GDP ratio and the deficit to GDP ratio, but we are also we also know that not all the growth comes from the public spending, and therefore using the strategy you proposed in Spinato and Morlin 2024, we deduce the contribution of the autonomous components of aggregate demand from the growth rate that we need to obtain, and therefore we in this way obtain the residual rate of growth that should be guaranteed by public spending. With this value, we can calculate the total amount of public spending and therefore its share over GDP by applying the simple arithmetic of fiscal multiplier. We maintain the revenue to GDP ratio that we found in the IMF fiscal monitor equal to 47.8%. And therefore, by means of different forecasts of interest rate and different hypotheses on fiscal multiplier, we calculate debt to GDP ratio and deficit to GDP ratio. This slide represents our goal. As you can see, we have a clearly lower unemployment rate at the end of the period by means of an higher than the one estimated by European Commission rate of growth of real GDP. And we present different scenarios. Today I'm presenting only two scenarios. The first one is based on the fiscal multiplier that we found in the European Commission papers equal to 0.75. As you can see, the results in terms of net government balance in percentage of GDP show that applying a policy that is aimed to obtain a very low unemployment rate, the net government balance seems to go better than in the European Commission scenario. While concerning the gross public debt, both the scenarios that we considered, one using the interest rate forecast provided by the Ministry of Economic and Finance, and one proposed by the DSM Debt Sustainability Monitor forecast, we obtain a level of debt to GDP ratio that is higher than the one that is estimated by the European Commission, but that show a downward trend after 2027. when we use an higher fiscal multiplier calculated in a paper that we published with the lady and Tosi, the results are better in the sense that we obtain a better path of net government balance, that is the green line on the right on the figure of left, and also a reduction at the end of the period of the public debt in percentage of GDP. Both if we consider the scenario, the interest rate forecast of MEF or of European Commission. We also extend to the 2041 our results, but I have no time to describe them, and therefore I can conclude. We can conclude that the European fiscal rules have compressed the growth. The new fiscal rules share many problems with the old ones, while fiscal policy oriented in producing low unemployment rate can produce good results on fiscal variables and also social benefits. Our results is in line with various trends of literature that demonstrates that austerity can have adverse effect both on GDP ratio and deficit to GDP ratio, and expansionary fiscal policy can enhance debt sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a moment. Can we have the discussant, Dr. Shafi, please?
Thank you, Davide, for your interesting presentation. Can you hear me? I have just some question and curiosity. The first one is about your simulation analysis, and I was wondering whether you can try to do your analysis considering the cutting of the public expenditure that are due to the new fiscal rule. So maybe you can make simulation in this line of area. I don't know if it's possible for your approach. The second one is connected to the impact that an increase in public expenditure can have on labor force or labor force participation rate. And I don't know if this is taken into account in your approach. The last two questions are about your idea of the symmetry that positive or negative demand shocks can have on the potential output. So if there is some asymmetry in your point of view. And there is a paper by Blanchard, Cerutti and Summers in 2015, which they consider the US economy and Portugal. And they say that while for the US there is hysteresis, so you have a level effect. For Portugal, they stress that there is a super hysteresis. So I don't know if could be interesting to see also some other European countries for in which you can simulate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to answer that, or should we take question? Yeah.
Thank you, Joanne. About the first questions, yes, we should replicate our analysis by looking at a cut to the public expenditure instead of an expansion of in the public expenditure. But actually, the cut at in the public expenditure is what the fiscal rule asked. Therefore, we decided to look, I said, at the effect of different policies with respect to the one that will be actually implemented. And yes, we can extend the analysis to a lot of variable when we estimate the Okun's law. Also, if in an indirect way we consider what happened at the labor force, that is the denominator of the unemployment rate. But okay, the goal of our exercise is quite different. Concerning the hysteresis issue and the symmetry between in the shock, I said, we do not estimate a potential. I said, actually, our potential output is the actual output, and therefore we have also the hypothesis that the effect of a fiscal expansion are persistent, are permanent, and therefore we incorporate the hysteresis issue. I think. I don't know if.
Okay. I think if you're the time, I'll take 3 questions at a time. Okay. Gentleman at the back, and you.
Autonomous consumption and autonomous investment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we go through you? Yeah, you had a.
I am a good puzzle when the fact to assume is not trade finding the government balance turn into surplus. Now, the whole logic of the austerity program of Europe was that Europe should have a current account surplus while having a government as a surplus, so that the private sector would not get into a deficit. But with your projection and with the term perspectives of the European current account, it is not feasible to achieve this growth rate while keeping the private sector into balance. So your scenario is either unfeasible or we can try to launch it.
Sorry. And then you. Yes.
Just a question about how did you estimate about this growth? Whether you consider the rise until 2024, whether you consider the public utilities of the language and the because I saw in my exercises that it changed the.
Okay, so if you answer these questions.
Okay, about the autonomous components, we consider as autonomous investment residential investment, and we use to obtain it the rate of growth that the Ministry of Economic, the MEF, forecast for the future, and we apply this rate of growth to the share of residential investment that we observed in the past. Instead, while the autonomous consumption is for us the credit to the consumer credit and the share of consumer credit over the total private consumption. About the and the export, of course, are the exports. Okay. About the question of Gennaro Zezza, okay, but we simply made this the difference between our public spending and our revenues, with the assumption that the percentage of the revenues on the GDP remains unchanged. So it's, I would say, we use simply the actual data and we extend.
So that we can say that the change depends on that one day. Okay. Of course, then the problem of what happens with the current account in Russian thing, for the United States. But of course, we're expecting the, we just have the net rating. Always worry that they're very doubtful, but that's just an exercise of comparison.
And about the Oculus law, yes, we found that in 2020 there is an outliers. We try to correct it by inserting a dummy variable, but I also run this law on different period, and more or less the coefficient is equal to 0.3 if I cut the period in 2019 instead of 2022, I think. Moreover, we decide also to use a very short period of time, because if we consider all the Italian history, the Oculus law changed a lot, but also the institutional labor market are changing, and the international context and so on. Thank you. No, sorry.
I mean, capacity starts with the point of view of the product. It's not I wonder whether your optimistic results depends on its definition of capacity utilization, which is then recognized. Somebody concerns
No. Yes, no, but
Yes.
we don't. No.
So there are it's not bad.
No, we don't have an output gap. We don't have potential output. We
Okay. Well, did you? Okay. No. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Gennaro Francesco. Francesco says on Italy's fiscal dilemma in a stock flow consistent model.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Professor, for the introduction. So I guess I will need to sit. So thank you so much, Professor, for the introduction. Always happy to be here at Astril. Also a thank to David and the other members of the Italian Post-Keynesian Network for co-organizing this special session. And so this is our work with Gennaro that we are currently finishing now in our drafts. So what are we doing here? Much in line with what Antonella and David, but also Antonella Palumbo is doing in the other presentations. We used our model, our stock flow model of the Italian economy that I developed for the PhD some years ago. We used the model to see what are the implications for growth and debt sustainability of the medium-term structural plan that the Italian government presented in November. So what we do is that we inserted the net expenditure part that Davide was speaking before of into our model and check if this is consistent with the targets of the fiscal rules and what are the macroeconomic implications. So this is the plan of my talk. I will start with a bit of context on the Italian economy over the last few years. And we will spend some minutes on the fiscal response to the COVID pandemic, as well as the monetary context we are living in now. And finally, I will spend a few minutes on how we constructed the baseline for the model. And then I will show you two simulation exercises where we check what happens if the government diverges from the fiscal rules, either in terms of additional austerity or in terms of expansionary policies. So this is much in line with what Davide was showing us before. This shows the long-run decline of the Italian economy vis-a-vis other Eurozone peers in blue and gray, and versus the United States in black. So as you can see from the graph, Italy is, so these are data from 1999, when the quarterly data starts in Italy from Istat, up to the second quarter of 2024. So this is the last available data. Q3 just became available some weeks ago. As you can see, Italy is it's actually the only country which never recovered from the 2008 crisis. We just achieved actually in Q3 the level of real GDP of 2007. And industrial production that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide is still very much below the pre-global financial crisis trend. And so we are witnessing in Italy, for the Italian economy, a long-run decline, both in absolute terms and in relative terms vis-a-vis both other Eurozone large countries and United States. Over the last 3 years, the situation seems to have changed a bit. So after the pandemic, Italy was one of the fastest growing country, not only Europe, but globally. So here on the left, we have real GDP indexed by at the end of 2019 with data again. So this is just a zoom on the previous two figures. And from here, you can see that Italy actually was one of the hardest hit country by the COVID pandemic, with GDP shrinking almost 20% on a quarterly basis. But then the economy jump-started in 2021, and by 2022, Italy reached the post-COVID growth of the United States. But then something happened, and the growth flattened by the end of 2022, and Italy's growth is now a bit depressing in numbers, while Spain has started to catch up and actually surpassed Italy in terms of post-crisis recovery. Again, this is a zoom on industrial production, where we see the same story with a steep increase in industrial production in the first phases of the post-pandemic period, but then again a declining trend. But what's behind this recovery? So here we have the demand components on the left. So with investment split between firms investment and housing investment by households and public investment by the government. And as you can see, this was an investment-driven recovery. With so the solid red line is housing investment, and these are actually. So here you have data from the end of 2019, indexed as 100, while here you have the long-run dynamics of investment. And as you can see, housing investment, which is the blue line on the right-hand side graph, is very much above its historical trend. So while firms investment actually went back to the pre-pandemic trend, but so the big part of the story under the behind the recovery is in public and particularly private households investment. And as all the Italians in the room, I guess, know, behind this rise in residential investment, there was a fiscal scheme approved by the government in 2020. This was called the super bonus, which was a 110% deduction of expenses that households incurred when upgrading their homes. So this program created a huge fiscal transfer from public resources to households to improve the stock of housing, and this created quite a few problems for the accountants at ISTAT. So once Eurostat, after a few rounds of talk with the government, at a certain point, Eurostat obliged the Italian government to systematize these expenses in national accounts. And so at a certain point, two new measures entered into our data. So on the one hand, financial stock appeared in financial accounts. So there was a stock of fiscal credits that there were an asset for the firm sector, and these are the fiscal credits the firms can use to repay the VAT, for example, in following years. While from the real side of the story, you had a fiscal transfer in terms of flows, real flows of money. You had fiscal transfer from the government to the household sector, and these were quite substantial. So these are plotted as the blue solid line. With the scale is the one on the left, I guess. So they arrived at a point of spending 30 billion per quarter in fiscal transfer. The stock of financial asset was at 200 billion and is now starting to decline as the program has ended. So this was the context in terms of the real economy. Then we have the financial sector. So we are now in a period of very strong monetary contraction. So quantitative easing policies are ended. So the ECB has increased a lot the interest rate, the base rates, but it also ended the bond acquisition programs. Both the public sector purchase program and the pandemic emergency purchase program are ended. And this produced a drain in liquidity over the last 2 years, with excess reserves disappearing from the financial system. But thankfully enough, this hasn't had that much effect on credit up to now, but we will see more effects in the coming years, especially if interest rates remain this high. In these two other figures, you can see on the left-hand side what happened in terms of so this is our base rate in the model that we use, the marginal lending facility, which is the highest of is the ceiling of the ECB corridor. And as one may notice, of course, sovereign yields followed the dynamics of the base rate. And these on the right are in turn the interest rates that banks charge or get from households and firms. And also in this case, you can see that some of these interest rates has overshoot the base rate increase, while others have undershoot it, especially the interest rate on deposits and mortgages have their increase is less than the increase in the base rate. So I guess I can skip these two slides because David has talked about how the Commission estimates the potential output. So this is from a recent paper I published together with some European co-authors, where we use the Commission model. So we replicated the European Commission model and the debt sustainability framework to calculate what are the expenditure paths needed for the big 4 European countries. And actually, this came out pretty precise. So this one I will skip. I guess Antonella will talk about a lot about how potential output is calculated in the Commission framework. So okay, what I will show you in a few minutes is potential output estimates and fiscal rule expenditures coherently with the DSA framework. What happens when we include this into our model? So what is our model about? So this is a large-scale stock flow consistent model. It's a multi-sector model with 6 sectors. We have households, banks, non-financial corporation, the central bank, the government, and the rest of the world. It's a very complex model with 15 financial assets. Demand and supply of assets are estimated either with single equations or with a VAR for with respect for households' demand for asset. We also estimate productivity and prices. And the whole model is based on quarterly data from the 90s up to the second quarter of 2024 for a total of over 260 equations. So this is the financial structure of the model. So this is the balance sheet of our institutional sectors. I think I can spend just 1 or 2 words on this. Yes, exactly. So I can skip this. So as I was telling you, this is quite a complex model. We have some 20-ish stochastic equations, which are estimated with normal econometric time series techniques, mainly OLS, but whenever we find statistical significance, we tend to use error correction models, which give a nicer and richer dynamics to our simulation. So this is how we estimate the main stochastic equations. When we modeled the pandemic, we needed to include, for example, the effect of the super bonus or residential investment. So we took care of that. And this is how our model performs in replicating our historical data. So the model is quite precise. So this is the real GDP, and this is the net lending of the institutional sector, so the private, public, and external balance in as percent of GDP, and the model tracks them quite accurately. These are the components of demand. Some of the cases, the goodness of fit of the model is not perfect, especially in the case of export and consumption for the first job after the financial crisis. So let's spend the last few minutes on the exercise. So as I was telling you, what we do is that we use the official projections that one can find in the medium-term fiscal structural plan of the government. And this is an extended path that the government has agreed upon with the European Commission, and using their models and their debt sustainability framework, this net expenditure path for government expenditure assures that by the end of the adjustment program, debt to GDP declines. So this is the assumption of both the Commission and the government that if they follow this expenditure path, then the debt to GDP will decline in the projection of the government starting in 2027, in the assumption of the Commission a bit later, but the dynamic is the same. So debt will increase for a bit in the first years and then will start declining. So this is just to give you a hint of what our results suggest. So our results are in red, while these are the projections for real GDP up to 2029 against the projection of the IMF in yellow, the European Commission. In the case also the light blue is if there is no adjustment program, and the dark blue is in the presence of the adjustment program, while the black lines, the black bars are the government projection for real GDP. And as you can see, we project a growth which is very low in 2025 and then declines up to 28, and we project to enter into a recession by the end of the decade. So again, our estimate point to the fact that once super bonus is absent, so absent this huge fiscal transfer from the government to the public sector, investments are set to decline. not to return back to their pre-pandemic trend, but still decline quite substantially by over 20% in the following years. And this, of course, has a dampening effect on growth, with consumption not so buoyant and investment dropping, then GDP declines. Here you have the financial balances, so the net lending of the institutional sectors, and the orange line is the public deficit that, as you can see, is increasing over the years, given our assumption. And this is so mainly because of interest expenses, which are, in the projections of the European Commission, the interest rate is set to increase in the next 2 or 3 years. So the assumption is that the interest rate will remain stable next year, and then will start to increase very slowly in the following years. And this produces a very high interest payments from the government, and this drags on government accounts so that the public deficit increases quite substantially. These are the other components of demand. So here we summarize our results. As you can see, there is this is just for a check. So we use the government expenditure part. So these same numbers you will find in the medium-term fiscal structural budget plan of the government. And the interesting thing here is that the revenues are quite stable over GDP, so that in reality, this so really the dynamics of net lending is just due to these increased interest expenditures that pose quite a number of problems. And the biggest one is this, so that when you look at what happens to debt, then we have opposite results with respect to the Commission. So the Commission assumes that GDP will decline if the government follows this path, but when inserted in our model, the opposite is true. So that the drag in fiscal expenditure will cause GDP to drop, and this will cause the debt to GDP to increase quite substantially in the coming years. So in very simple simulations, we check what happens if then, so as Davide was telling us before, the fiscal rule imposed for countries that are, as Italy, in an excessive deficit procedure, some numerical safeguards, which means that if the government does not achieve its target, then it must cut expenses in order to cut the debt to GDP by at least 0.5% per year, but in theory it should be 1% per year. So we propose two alternative scenarios. In the first one, we say, okay, so assume that a new Minister of Finance, which is very heterodox and very post-Keynesian, say, okay, we do not want to follow the rules, we do not want to follow Brussels' suggestion, and so we will do exactly the opposite and start spending more. While in the second scenario, we assume instead that the government sticks to the rules, and since in 2024 and 2025 the debt is increasing, then in 2036 starts cutting expenditure, so embarking in austerity to close. And the results are plotted here. So of course you have an expansionary, the expansionary policy will increase GDP growth, and this is the top left quadrant, and produce a very steep decline in the unemployment rate. So you have a very good outcome in terms of the real economy. And in terms of debt to GDP, you have a decline in the first 2 or 3 in the first 3 years, but then a very slight increase with respect to the baseline. However, if you look at the level of debt, so this is the change in debt to GDP, while this is the level. So from the level, you can see that whatever the government does, austerity or expansionary policy, the dynamic of the debt to GDP is more or less the same. And so what is this telling us is that the biggest problem at the moment is about the interest rates, because this result is driven mainly by these interest payments, and also by a number of adjustments in the financial sector. So interest rate this high also are operate as an incentive for households or firms, for example, to invest their money in the financial sector, taking away funds from the real economy. So if you have interest rate this high, then you make much more money investing in financial instruments than investing in the real economy. So summing up, just to close, our simulations show that there are a lot of downside risks to the Italy's growth projection, Italy growth prospects over the next few years. And the biggest one is that all these exercises are based on the assumption, which we took from the Commission and the IMF, which is related to trade dynamics. So in the exercises of the Commission, trade is set to remain quite strong over the next years, but this is very unlikely. We have increasing geoeconomic tension, geopolitical tension between Russia, China, Russia and the United States and China, and the new administration threatening to impose tariffs on European goods, and austerity that is set to take place in Europe that will reduce demand for imports from other European countries. So the only sources of growth that are still around are very unlikely to be around for much longer. And I guess I can stop here, so I won't take any more time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
10 minutes, I suppose. No, less. Thank you very much. And thank you, Francesco and Gennaro, for this interesting paper. I think I see that it is, so I saw it on paper. It's an interesting session for the fact that we are, the topic of the papers are very close. We are on the same line. We are discussing, criticizing the new rules that, as well as the old fiscal rules, create problems, or at least are not able to solve them. And we are discussing whether it is possible to imagine different scenarios. So there are just, I like the general approach of your paper. There are some questions that I would like to pose, because it's more interesting to speak about either differences or doubts. First of all, let me say that I appreciate your reference to Superbonus, or in general to the very strong fiscal policies that have been made during 2021 and 22. And I think that it is very transparent, very evident from data how important is expansionary fiscal policy, and how different is this recovery, this post-COVID recovery, from any other recovery of the last 20 years. So does this mean that Italy is condemned to very low growth, that it is impossible to have any expansion of production in a very short period? It is not. In my view, it is very, very, very evident that the economy reacts, even if it reacted from a very low level. The other thing is about interest rates. I agree very much with you. I think that the point is interest rates. It's something that I wanted to say to Antonella and Davide also. I will talk about this in my exercise, so I will not deal with it now. About your model, which is too complex for me to understand and follow, so please forgive, but there are at least a couple of things that maybe are minor. One is about the interpretation of the divergence between saving and investment in the non-financial sector. You say explicitly in the paper, and you said also in your presentation, that there is an excess of saving according to your data, to the accounts, an excessive of saving in the non-financial sector with respect to investment. And we interpret it as the behavior on the part of non-financial firms that are not keen on investment. But I would like you to put this idea in relation with theory, in relation with either Keynesian or Kaleskian theory, the fact that it is investment that produces saving. So how did it happen theoretically? Can you really interpret these accounting identities as theoretical or behavioral relations, as you seem to do? Perhaps I'm wrong in interpreting you. Were there investment before that they stopped, that firms stopped, or does demand come and so saving come from some other source? What did happen, and how do you relate theory and I imagine you are Keynesian or Kaleskian at least, but if you're not, okay. And well, the other point is, but this is really not important now in this discussion, but it's about the Phillips curve. Do you really need the Phillips curve in your model? Because I reviewed an enormous literature, I mean, not in writing, but just in studying on the Phillips curve. There is no way of finding a Phillips curve. Do we really need it in empirical or theoretical analysis as heterodox? This is a question that I always bring to any kind, since I saw that you use it. Okay, stop.
Can I gather a full?
Yes. It can be brought down the image.
Yes.
Also, it's a very silly question. So you told us that 100, you found that 100 euros increase in the super bonds led to a 48 euros in the international,
Additional.
which is range exactly. As far as I understand, each euro given to the super bonds is directly attached to at least slightly less than €1 spent. Okay, it's the 100 spent nature budget. My expectation would be that for each euro of the super bonds, you have €1 of extra spending, be it residential investment, perhaps some durable consumption because of because I have no idea. My expectation, without knowing too much about, is that even taking a multiplier equal to 1, should then consider 100 euros of extra spending. How is that possible in this way? Thank you.
So,
Yes.
The first year.
Okay. It's very hard to understand the result of the condition about the fact that the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio are falling is only and exclusively because they assume that the economy will go back to potential output. Independently of the fact that it has been below it for all the period of the adjustment, the GDP, the debt to GDP increased. So I wonder, if there is a projection, the debt to GDP ratio increases up to 2028. And then it declines because they assume that to conclude the adjustment period, the fiscal adjustment, GDP will go back to potential by something like this. So I'm going to hear a different result about the trend of the GDP ratio. Simply depends on the fact that we don't have this assumption. We don't have any intervention. I mean, just what is really.
I have just a simple doubt on your managed to test equations. Maybe the difference of treatment between exports and imports. In your equation of imports, you insert relative prices, but in your equation of exports, its real effective exchange rate. Why the difference between those variables or they are the same?
Similar variables, not exactly the same.
Very short, just what you wrote their prices of the natural assets and how is it growing relative to the current state.
Again.
The prices of financial assets.
Okay, so I didn't comment.
The coupling between zero growth of real and growth of capital value of financial assets. Can this divide be permanent or in the model the decoupling can continue, or do you think there are some mechanism correction of possible crisis in the how can increasing financial values can be validated in a situation of zero growth?
I always tell everyone to keep trying to get the answer very rich.
Okay, so
Okay, so I will go in a strange order, starting from the sixth. So I will go in a strange order in answering the question, starting from the simplest, which is the one from Jose. So why different variables in our estimates for imports and export equation? So we are very pragmatic in our estimates in these models. So this is a very large model and is estimated on quarterly data. So also the data are quite volatile. And we follow a very pragmatic approach in the sense that we are very data driven. So why we use in one equation the relative price and in the other the exchange rate is simply because econometrically it works better. So simple answer to a simple question. So finally, then about the asset prices. So in this kind of models, you don't have turning points. So you don't have that in dynamics and something happens and you see a global financial crisis, but then you see the buildup of imbalances. And this is one of such imbalances that gives you a signal that something bad is going to happen. So when you have, for example, that the private sector balance is going negative, so it means that the private sector is getting into debt. This can go on for a number of periods, but eventually it will lead to a financial crisis because people get into debt, and at a certain point they need to pay it back. So in this sense, we can use the insights from the model to look at dangerous imbalances in the economy. So this is how we are using this. And actually, there are a number of signals that we are on the verge of a new financial crisis. So especially if we look at United States, you see there is a big divergence in the prices of financial assets and real goods. You see there is a lot of income inequality, which is rising. And since the rich own the financial assets and these assets are getting you more and more and more money, and wages are declining. So you have a huge increase in inequality, a large divergence in prices of assets. This sets the stage for a new financial crisis as soon as something happens on the international stage. About Riccardo, the super bonus. So Gennaro, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is our additional investments. And our measure, actually, our estimates, it's not so different from the one made by Banca Italia. So Bank of Italy this summer published a very nice paper on the super bonus where they used either synthetic controls or input-output tables to estimate what are the additional investment that happened because of the super bonus or the fiscal transfer. Their numbers align with ours. So it's not so strange. Then again, do I trust completely my 48 euros? No, I do not trust them completely. As always, you don't have to trust your model blindly. I guess that the effect is stronger. So I mean, if you take the long run trend of housing investment, this boom that you had in the last 2 or 3 years is very much bigger than such a low multiplier. But if you try to estimate econometrics, this is what the data tells you. Finally, about the firm's net lending position, the tough question by Antonella. So we do take into account investment, of course. So if you want to go back to theory, I will go back to the theory of financialization, for example. So why are firms not investing? Because they look at the long run prospects of the economy and they know that the economy is not doing so well, and while they see financial prices increases. So if you're a firm and you need to decide how to make money, and your shareholders want to maximize their profits, then they would say invest your money in the financial sector instead of building a new plant and take on risk and take on stuff. You can just invest in your funds in the financial sector, which means that you must have a positive net lending position, because this gives you the funds to invest in the financial sector. So you keep investment down in order to increase your savings, in order to invest your savings into financial instruments and thus get a higher profit.
Basically, thinking line with Kaleski models applied to the financialization.
Yes. Antonella doesn't seem convinced.
I will talk to her. Okay. Our next presentation is from Giovanna.
Okay. So, thank you for the introduction. The paper that I'm going to present, which is entitled Government Spending Multiplier and Public Debt Sustainability, an Empirical Assessment for OECD's Countries, is written in collaboration with Professors Matteo De Leidi and Michele Capriati from the University of Bari Aldo Moro. In this paper, we aim to assess the impact of total public expenditure on the GDP level and the public debt sustainability, for which we take the public debt to GDP ratio. Specifically, we analyze whether the level of public debt to GDP ratio can have an influence on the magnitude of fiscal multipliers and on the sustainability of fiscal stimulus. We assess this nonlinearity by estimating and discriminating between periods of high and low debt scenarios. To do this, we use a quite standard empirical approach that combines structural vector autoregressive modeling with a local projection approach for a panel of 14 OECD countries. To assess these non-linearities, we employ a smooth transition local projection model for which we calculate our threshold considering the within-country variation in the public debt. And we also deal with the fiscal foresight issue that is something well known in the fiscal multiplier literature. If we consider the literature on fiscal policy and public debt sustainability, we have to take into account the fact that the public debt to GDP ratio dynamics is influenced by the inflation rate, the nominal interest rate, the real growth rate of the output, and the primary deficit to GDP ratio. So if we want to analyze whether an increase in public expenditure has an impact on the public debt to GDP ratio, we have to take into account these different channels. But from an empirical point of view, we decide to analyze directly the impact that an increase in public expenditure has on the public debt to GDP ratio. And as I said in Auerbach and Goronichenko 2017, considering the literature on fiscal consolidation and the perverse effect that these episodes can have on the sustainability of the public debt, there are quite large literature that stress the fact that fiscal consolidation may be self-defeating in the sense that they are introduced to reduce the public debt to GDP ratio, but since this consolidation produce a negative impact on the GDP level, they at the end increase the public debt to GDP ratio. And this is also shown in a few empirical studies in which these studies stress the fact that fiscal consolidation produce an increase in the public debt to GDP ratio in the short run, and especially during a period of low economic activity during slack periods. Concerning the literature on fiscal multipliers, following the work of Blanchard de Perotti 2002, the literature showed that fiscal multipliers are positive, with value close to 1 that range between 0.8 and 1.5. Following the work of Blanchard de Perotti, two streams of literature emerge in the fiscal multipliers framework. The first one considered the impact of different types of public expenditure, considering, for example, public investment versus public consumption. And the second stream of literature considered the role of nonlinearity regarding the impact of fiscal policies during period of recession or expansionary periods. And in this case, we do not have an unanimous picture, as some work stress that multipliers tend to be higher during periods of slack periods, while the work of Rami and Zubairi stress the fact that fiscal multipliers are acyclical, and there is the work of Alozza that stress the fact that fiscal multipliers are higher in expansion than during recession. Finally, the type of nonlinearity that we are analyzing consider the level of government debt in influencing the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. Also, in this case, there is not an unanimous picture, as some work stress the fact that countries that faces high level of public debt should have a low value of fiscal multipliers, and this is due to the fact that in their idea, agents are Ricardian agents that reduce their consumption and thus increase their savings because they expect an increase in taxes in future. While some work stress that there is not differences between in the fiscal multiplier between countries with high and low level of public debt. And finally, the work of Boitani and co-authors stress the fact that fiscal multipliers are higher in countries with a high level of public debt, and this is due to a negative correlation between saving rate and the public debt to GDP ratio. So what we do is an empirical analysis for a panel of 14 OECD countries. Our time span goes from 1981 to 2017. We evaluate the impact of total public expenditure on the GDP level and the public debt to the GDP ratio. We also have in our dataset the short-term interest rate, and we also consider the forecast for government expenditure. For the methodology, we combine the structural vector autoregressive modeling with the local projection approach. We identify government spending shocks through a Cholesky factorization, in which total public expenditure is considered as the most exogenous variable. Since we have annual data, we select one lag for our model. So we estimate the equation number 1 in these slides, and our shocks are given by the residual of this equation. We perform what in the literature is called the ex-ante procedure. So we rescale our fiscal policy shocks. So the impulse response function that I will show to you for the GDP directly represent the value of the fiscal multiplier, while for the public debt to GDP ratio, the impulse response function show us the percentage point decrease or increase following an increase in public expenditure. Once we have identified and rescaled our fiscal policy shocks, we introduce them into our local projection equation, and we estimate the impulse response function from this equation. We have time and country fixed effect and a set of control variables that includes all the variables that we have in the model with a lag equal to 1. And our variable of interest, that is YIT plus H, is both the GDP level and the public debt to GDP ratio. In order to assess the nonlinearity that states from high and low public debt scenario, we use a smooth transition local projection approach. So essentially, we augment this equation with a function that measures a smooth movement from periods of high public debt to low public debt scenarios. And we estimate this the equation number 3 in the slides, in which we have high and low public debt to GDP ratio periods. Our transition function is defined in number 4 of the equation in these slides, and these functions range between 0 and 1. And value close to 0 indicates period of low public debt to GDP ratio, whereas value near to 1 indicates period of high public debt to GDP ratio. This is an approach in which we consider a within country variation. So, for example, we are considering Italy in the period in which Italy experienced low or high public debt to GDP ratio. In our paper, we have 2 different model specifications. In the first one, the variable are in growth rate. In the second one, variable are in log level. To preserve any co-integration relationship that may exist among our variable, and we follow the literature reporting the cumulative effect. And this is due to the fact that we can have a different level of persistence of public expenditure. So we follow Rami and Zubari in this aspect. And we also consider the role of government spending forecast, but for time constraint, I do not show you the results, but they are similar to the baseline cases. If we look at the linear model, in this case, we have that the first graph represents the response of public expenditure to its own shocks. The second figure reports the value of the response of the GDP to a public expenditure shock, and the third one is the response of the public debt to GDP ratio to government spending shocks. As I said before to you, for the GDP, the y-axis directly represents the value of the multiplier, while for the public debt to GDP ratio, we have percentage point decrease in that case. Our results for the linear model stress that we find a positive impact of fiscal policy shocks on the GDP level, and we find that an increase in public expenditure lower the public debt to GDP ratio. And this is true in both models, even if in the first model with variable in rate of growth, we have an higher persistence in the effect of the public debt to GDP ratio. When we move, okay, thank you. When we move to the non-linear analysis, our results show us that fiscal multipliers are higher in a higher public debt to GDP ratio than in a low public debt to GDP scenarios, and that a rise in government expenditure reduce public debt to GDP ratio, and the reduction is greater in a high debt scenarios than in a low debt scenarios. We can skip this. So the fact that a rise in government expenditure produce a reduction in the public debt to GDP ratio that is higher in a high debt scenario is due to two types of mechanisms. The first one is the fact that we have higher multipliers for the high public debt scenarios. So we have an higher impact at the denominator of the ratio. The second mechanism is related to the fact that even if we have multipliers equal in both scenarios, country that has a higher public debt level would require a lower multiplier to decrease the public debt to GDP ratio. And this is because, as we know, the public debt to GDP is a ratio, so we have an increase in public expenditure that produces an increase in the numerator, but also an increase in the denominator of that ratio. And specifically, as Ciccone in 2013 stressed, there is a condition that needs to be the condition that guarantee the fact that an increase in public expenditure produce a reduction in the public debt to GDP ratio is that the multiplier has to be higher than the inverse of the public debt to GDP ratio. So to conclude, we can, as the previous presentation stress, there is a new reform of the EU fiscal rules that stress that country that have a higher level of public debt that is higher 19% or between 60 and 19% has to reduce their public expenditure, the current nationally public expenditure, as we see if these type of policies were implemented, this could lead to a reduction in the GDP level and also on the sustainability of the sustainability of public finance could not improve, especially in countries that are characterized by a higher level of public debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Ciaffi. We've got now Davide Romaniele, who will give us the
Se solo riuscissi a leggere la mia scrittura. Thank you, Joanna. Very brilliant presentation. I think that all of us are sympathetic with your results, and I have only two suggestions for your future works and paper. First of all, I think that in the presentation could be, you could move the explanation of your results, the theoretical explanation of your results when you presented the model, because for me, was not very clear why you have the different results in the two scenario. And at the moment, it's not immediately clear the results that you justify citing Boitani in 2022. Then probably you could consider to split the panel amongst groups of countries, considering, for example, different macroeconomic condition, the role of central bank, and so on, to test the robustness of the results. And another things that I understood working on this topic is that several other variables are relevant, and you state different mechanisms at the beginning of your presentation that can affect the path of public debt to GDP ratio. Therefore, you can, for example, interest rate, but also inflation rate, I think, and you should try to construct a more comprehensive model. Then, if I understood well, the nonlinearity works in the sense that you estimate the same shock in two different scenario, no? But the shock is the same. Okay, now it's clear for me, and I want to ask to you if you think that this methodology could be helpful to estimate a nonlinear Phillips curve that, as you know, we should work on this, because I think that with a nonlinear Phillips curve, it could reappear in every time, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, question, Francesco. Please speak up.
So, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, so if I'm not wrong, where do we be switching estimates, so into states, the decline in debt to GDP is very strong for high debt economies. What is the rationale? Because I mean, I get so if going back to the other things, for example, free spending, very high debt economy, so as we were seeing before, interest rate expand is not about interest rate. And that is why I talk about investments are. What is your point?
Anyone got any other questions? No. Uncle.
Just a question, quickly. One question was the same time, why the preventative is investing in strategy. The other question, since it's not about your test, but about the size of the multiplier in different states. I think that the point is whether what is the size of the change from spending with respect to the state of the economy. Because if you have restrictive fiscal policy, the recession, this has a huge multiplier, which is actually one of the reasons why in the literature you find that the recession part of the multiplier is difficult, and maybe the effect of recession everyone. So it should be a missing piece in the about the multiplier.
Okay, could I just add to this that I'm slightly surprised by your the point that you made in your paper that the fiscal multiplier is higher in recessions than in than when the economy is booming, because my impression was that when in the maybe before COVID, when there was the big discussion about government expenditure multipliers, it was very clear that the estimates were going down and down and down, and the reason why the estimates for public expenditure multiplier, government expenditure multipliers were going down was because actually the economy was going into stagnation. So there was actually very little growth, change in GDP that could be attributed to changes in expenditure. But this is this was a rather general view. Would you like to answer your question?
So for the fact that we find multiplier that are higher for high public debt periods, the motivation in Boitani is the only paper that finds the results similar to us, and it's not so much convincing also me and Matteo, but this is the justification that we write in the paper. Regarding the question of Davide of splitting the panel, thank you. Is I think it could be interesting, and also we are working on analyzing the impact on nominal real interest rate and inflation rate. With some caveat in mind, because for the empirical approach that we are using, you have to make some assumption that would be okay, maybe. And for the shock, yes, we estimate the shocks in a linear model, and then we introduce it in a nonlinear framework. We also try to estimate the shocks using a nonlinear equation and then introduce in the smooth transition local projection. Results does not change so much. Of course, you can use this type of analysis also for the nonlinear Phillips curve. So we can make this. For the fact that the public debt to GDP ratio, the reduction is higher for high level of public debt to GDP ratio. This is a quite arithmetical analysis because if you consider the fact that an increase in public expenditure produces an impact on the GDP. Yeah, of course, but if you look at decreasing a cutting in public expenditure, you have a negative impact at the denominator and a negative impact at the numerator. But if you have a cut in public expenditure, for sure reduce debt and reduce the GDP. But if you have a high level of public debt, the reduction that you have in the numerator of that ratio is lower than the reduction that you have in the denominator of the ratio. So for sure you have an increase. Yeah, okay, we can discuss this, but in the short run, this is for just one or two period is from an arithmetical point of view. If you consider that public expenditure has an impact on the GDP, yes, 5 periods that are 5 years. Considering the fiscal multiplier with the sign and period of boom and recession, we are trying to work on this type of nonlinearities. Another interesting point is that the literature differentiate between deep recession. So, for example, 28, yes, and in that case, you find very different results between normal period and recession, but would be interesting to analyze the sign of the shocks during that period. That could be an interesting topic to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. We have the last paper by Dr. Palumo on public debt adjustment with expansion and growth, and effects of a different notion, potential.
So you have to put. So thank you very much, Professor Toporowski. I'm sorry if my paper, our paper, because I have a bunch of co-authors, is in a provisional state. These slides are intended to give you the results, the methodology, but they're not, but they're incomplete. For example, there are very few or no references to the literature. However, of course, we put this in relation with other works. So what is the aim of the paper? Our focus is on policy, especially on the new European rules, which have been very often mentioned already in this session, and specifically on the structural plan, which is required for the reduction of the debt-GDP ratio. since this work starts from the previous works that I and other co-authors did on the notion, the measurement of potential output, this is again a way of applying our reasoning on our critical reasoning on potential output to the new fiscal framework. Our idea, which has been already mentioned in a way, although there are some differences, but our idea is that the potential output still retains a fundamental role, notwithstanding the attempt on the part of the European Commission to free the new rules from these unobservable variables, as they're called. But there is now a little possibility, a novelty, let's say, in the rules. For the first time, the actual estimation method of potential output is not left entirely free, but there is an opening to the possibility that member states propose and discuss different procedures. And this is due to all the problems that have been mentioned also here, but that have been reviewed and detected also by institutions, also by the European Parliament and the European Commission. So the idea that past rules were rather pro-cyclical is quite accepted now, not only in heterodox or critical literature, but in mainstream and in policy applied literature as well. So what we do is a particular kind of exercise. We take seriously the new rules, although we have a lot of complaints about them and we are very critical, but we take them seriously and we try only to change the notion and the measurement of potential output and see what happens. But as you will see, we need two different notions in a way of potential output in order to... So we also make a simulation which is different from the others that we already have heard here, but with a similar aim, to show that an expansionary path of growth is compatible with debt, with a reduction of the debt-GDP ratio, and even respecting the new fiscal rules. It is a tour de force because the new fiscal rules are really, but anyway, we try. So, okay, I think that I don't need too much to stress to describe what are the new fiscal rules. The shift of emphasis that the Commission tried to make from stability to growth in the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact was actually half done, but actually in the negotiation that followed, especially with the European Council, what happened in the end in the rules that have been finally implemented in April 2024, we have many of the rules that reproduce, even with different variables, some of the strict regulation of before. So, for example, the year-to-year adjustment in the debt-GDP ratio is now requested, while in the original proposal of the Commission, which was made at the end of 2022, this was not requested, but the idea was to shift emphasis to a medium to long period adjustment. Anyway, it is already been I will speak of this later. Anyway, the main point, especially from the theoretical and also policy point of view, is that in the conception of the European Union, of the European institutions, and in the very way in which the rules are written, the idea is implicit that fiscal adjustment can be attained only through austerity. But this is not written as a rule. It's only the framework that has inspired these rules, and is also the way in which the European Commission elaborates its own models in order, for example, to perform the debt sustainability analysis for each country. But the rules do not say that austerity is necessary. They only prescribe the fact that the new indicator, the net primary expenditure, public primary expenditure, has to follow a certain path without exceeding the rate of growth, which is the potential rate of growth, let's say, and also that the debt GDP ratio and the deficit GDP ratio have to follow a certain path of adjustment. Okay, so this is exactly the point where we try to address the fact that austerity is implicit but not prescribed as a rule, the fact that potential output is still very important, although in a different manner than before. The two points in which you can see the role of potential output is first in the excessive deficit procedure, which you have that the structural deficit must be adjusted 0.5 percentage points per year for the countries that have an excess deficit above 3%. The other is the notion of potential GDP growth, and not only of the level, but the growth of potential GDP is very relevant for the elaboration of the projections about the growth of actual output in the medium to long term. So we try 3 different exercises in this paper, and I will very briefly try to describe them because the time does not allow to go in depth, but then the first exercise is a very conservative one. We accept everything, including the standard definition of potential output as corresponding to the non-inflationary rate of unemployment, the NAVRO actually. And we also accept even the standard method of estimation, even if we have a lot of misgivings on it. And we only change the estimated NAVRO. We change it on the basis of the fact that the European Commission performed many different estimates over time of the NAVRO, and you can see in this graph the difference between real-time estimates, which are the red line, and let's say ex-post estimates of the European Commission. These actually are the estimates of potential GDP that derive from the NAVRO, so I did not show the NAVRO itself. And as you can see, real-time estimates, which are the most relevant for policy because are those which are used when policy has to be implemented, are much more pro-cyclical than ex-post estimates. So we just use the pre-2009 crisis estimates of the NAVRO that the European Union produced for Italy. We use an average over 5 years, so it's not a point estimate, but for a period. We substitute it in the procedure of the European Commission, and we obtain much larger, let's say, much larger cyclical component, so of the structural budget, which in terms of billions of euro means much lower need for cutting public expenditure in order to respect the rule, the deficit rule. So we could comply with the excessive deficit procedure by changing the notion, marginally changing, because in this case we do not change the notion. We only adjust the estimates of the NAVRO because they are obviously unrealistic, since the European Commission changes it ex post. Okay, then we pass to the second exercise of the paper, which is most relevant more relevant as regards the long-run projection. And here a different notion of potential output is needed, a notion that is based, of course, on demand-led growth. This has been already mentioned from the theoretical point of view, so I will be quick here, but it is, let's say, a strong notion of hysteresis. Of course, it means that resources and productivity itself are endogenous to the growth of demand. But the fact is, what does this mean? So let's start with historical analysis. These are Italian data taken from the Ameco datasets of Italian GDP since 1965 until 2023. And as you can see, there is a progressive decrease, a very, very neat decrease in the rate of growth of GDP in the various expansionary phases that we can observe in our history. And these expansionary phases have been identified by means of a quadratic trends on first differences. We make this decomposition of growth in the different phases, and we find that most of growth, especially in the high growth phases, is due to productivity, to labor productivity. And I would like to stress that even in the 60s and early 70s, in which we could think of an expanding economy, productivity was, growth in productivity was very important, while the labor input was shrinking already. So we also calculate some average of productivity. Then we go to the future and we look at the European Commission projections for the period until 2050, and you can observe that the black line is the lowest of the rates of growth, that the growth path that we observed in reality. You can observe how the European Union penalizes the Italian economy still more for the future. And there are even differences between the different sources that the European Union produces. This is the Debt Sustainability Monitor. This is the aging report, different offices of the same commission. Okay. But then we try to make alternative growth projections by taking into account what is that lowers the path of growth is the projection of very low demographic trend, very, very negative demographic trends for Italy, plus the idea that potential output is nothing else than the average of actual output, and so the future projection of very low path growth. We change some of the hypotheses. We accept the European Commission demographic trends, but we focus on the possible enhancement of labor productivity through targeted public investment, noticing that past productivity was at least 3% by any kind of average. We project a reduction in unemployment rates up to 5%, and increase the participation rate and some immigration flows a bit higher than the Commission projects. And we can easily show that with this device we can arrive at a 2% percentage growth per year of potential output, which means that there is the potential space for growth of actual output, but does not mean, of course, that this can be realized unless demand is strong enough. And then we try the last minute, we try the exercise of that sustainability by assuming some hypotheses. For example, the inflation rate we take from the DSM, the Debt Sustainability Monitor, we assume an implicit nominal interest rate of 1% real over the whole simulation period, we assume an increase, a yearly increase in 1.85 in public expenditure, in net expenditure, as a multiplier of 1, and the elasticity of tax revenue taken from the European Commission. And we can show that there is a decreasing path of that GDP ratio. And this is just a robustness check with a fun chart that is stochastic, that includes some stochastic elements on interest rates and on multipliers. So the message of all this is that it is possible, and it is possible to make expansion and obtain a reduction in that GDP ratio, even respecting the new fiscal rules. Of course, the problem is with interest rates, because in the debt sustainability monitor, it is projected a 2% real interest rate over the 30-year period, so in the very long period. 2% real means that fiscal policy should either be extremely expansionary, or that the idea is to suffocate this growth. So a very restrictive monetary policy, as the European Commission seems to prescribe more than predict, could be very negative. But it is not coincident with what the central bank is doing now. So let's see what the future tells us.
I did not receive the paper, so okay, Antonella confirms. So there isn't too much to comment upon, because I very much, I mean, of course, we are pretty much on the same line. Just if I understand properly, what you do, especially in the last part, when you estimate potential output, you re-estimate potential output with somewhat different assumptions, higher productivity, so higher growth, higher participation, and then apply the idea that the net expenditure must grow less than potential output. But since is this it? So I didn't, maybe I did not grasp how you obtain this decline. What happens to fiscal policy once you re-examine the potential output? And I think that my main point. Also, I didn't quite understand during this position how exactly you change the value of the NABRO. You just take the ex-post estimates, and what would be the effect of the fact that now we seem to have a low unemployment rate? How would that affect taking the current unemployment rate as the new NABRO? What effect, what impact would it have?
Take all the questions, because yes, you have it.
Yes.
So you are trying to be roughly 1990. So my question would be, how can you reconcile the concept of opportunity in both ways of the money?
Well, I have a view. I agree with the approach of the Netherlands law, but as a Latin American economist, I think that whilst the economy produces maximum for economic growth, so how can Italy, Spain, or France, or Germany can accelerate the rate of economic growth without reindustrializing the economy, which means that without raising the manufacturing shares?
Yes, just one part of question, this endorsements activity. If you can compare the land-facility growth with something which is going to happen when the structural composition of the economy has not changed. We have structurally increasing employment elasticity levels are lower than Italy, with declining productivity. This is due to global efforts of specialization. Do you take into account this factor that endorsements of activity might lower consistency?
Thank you. So many questions and not easy ones. I will try to be. So Antonella, sorry that you did not receive the paper and that the exposition was perhaps not very clear, but of course the main variable that we use in order to produce these expansionary paths is net primary expenditure. So the idea is that we produce this expansionary path through public expenditure. Specifically, we also have the idea that public expenditure should not be used in an undifferentiated way, but that some specific targeted public investment and social consumption should be the main contents of this public expenditure. By targeted public investment, we mean investments in the energy sectors, investment in some high productivity sector related to why energy? Because energy is the main constraint on Italian growth when it comes to imports and to the external constraint. So the idea is that both consumption, public consumption and investment and public investment show the highest multiplier, while taxes and transfer are very low multipliers. And the idea is that the government should select exactly this kind of expenditure, also, of course, thinking of the social content of what it is doing. So this is about the scenarios. So the other hypotheses on interest rates and so on are of course other hypotheses that are needed. But with the exercises, we wanted to show that the potential space for demand to growth is there, because the problem is that the European Union says that we are condemned to a very low growth because our labor input will shrink, and it will shrink even with all our hypotheses. So it is true that the decrease in the labor force will be from a certain point on relevant for Italy. So the question is how to make room for higher growth coming from demand. It's not that, it's just to show the elasticity, not that this is the cause of growth. So I think that I also answered more or less your question. It is true that what the economy produces matters. And of course, we are not thinking of weapons in order to enhance productivity growth. But Italy, with Germany, is still the second manufacturing economy in Europe. So I think that there is a manufacturing basis, but manufacturing is not the only sector in which productivity can be high. About the elasticity of productivity of output to growth, your question is very interesting. I couldn't dwell with this, but the fact is that in recent decades, Italy, and not only Italy, but the United States in part, and much of Europe in part, choose a development model which is based on the excessive use of labor and the low productivity growth. So it's a choice. It's not something which is given by Ball effect, because you can see during the history of the mature economies that there are different phases in which you can also. So the idea is that you cannot do this structural adjustment just by expanding public expenditure. Either you change the structure of the economy and you decide how to grow in the next years, which means a government which is strong enough also to decide to have a say in the matter of what is produced and how, and not only in a generic expansion of expenditure. But yes, the model should change. Also because we cannot count on an ever expanding labor input.
Okay. Well, if that's, did you want to say something? Okay. In that case, thank you very much, Professor Palma, for this very excellent presentation. Thanks to all the speakers. We still have time for coffee.
I should interact with the
I don't know.
no.
I think if we are
Yes, I have last.
doing,
Davide.
yeah, that's Davide.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's very interesting. I'm very pleased to meet you.
Yes, I guess. I remember the Calais conference in Krakow.
Are you a
17.
something like this? Yes, yes. It was